The oil pressure gauge hit zero at 11,000 feet. Captain Robert Johnson watched black smoke pour from his P-47's cowling as flak fragments tore through the engine block. Below him, the French countryside crawled with German armor. No Allied airfields within gliding distance. No parachute landing zone that wasn't enemy-held territory. The control stick shuddered in his hands. 200 gallons of high-octane fuel sat 18 inches behind his seat. The engine was on fire, the propeller windmilling uselessly, and he had maybe 90 seconds before the wing tanks cooked off. His wingman's voice crackled through the radio. "Bail out, sir. Bail out now." Johnson looked down at the roads below, packed with Wehrmacht trucks fleeing the Falaise Pocket. He pushed the stick forward into a dive. By the summer of 1944, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was the aircraft nobody wanted to talk about. While P-51 Mustangs escorted bombers to Berlin and grabbed headlines, the Thunderbolt, 7 tons of radial engine and armor plate, got the missions no one else could survive. Too heavy for dogfighting. Too slow to catch the Luftwaffe's best interceptors. Too brutish for the romantic image of fighter combat the press corps wanted to sell. Commanders called it a flying milk bottle. Pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and that nickname told you everything about how they actually felt. Between June and September 1944, P-47s flew more combat sorties over France than any other Allied fighter. They destroyed more tanks, more locomotives, more trucks, and more fortified positions than the entire 8th Air Force heavy bomber fleet in the same period. Yet when the war ended and the histories got written, the Thunderbolt disappeared into footnotes. The official narratives credited strategic bombing and Mustang air superiority for winning the European air war. What those narratives left out was the grinding, low-altitude nightmare that decided the Battle of Normandy, and the fighter that turned out to be built specifically for that kind of hell. The 405th Fighter Group arrived at Advanced Landing Ground A-12 outside Bayeux on June 15, 1944, 9 days after D-Day. A-12 wasn't an airfield. It was a bulldozed wheat field with a pierced steel planking runway that buckled in the heat and turned into a swamp when it rained. No hangars, no revetments, no parts depot. Pilots slept in tents 30 yards from the flight line and woke up to German artillery fire every third morning. The group's orders were simple: 4 sorties per day, every day, until the Wehrmacht stopped moving or the group ran out of aircraft. Targets of opportunity below 5,000 feet, the altitude where German flak could track you from the moment you crossed the bomb line until you pulled off target. This was the mission profile the Thunderbolt had been accidentally designed for. Its Pratt & Whitney, our 2800 radial engine, could absorb punishment that would down any inline engine fighter. The cockpit sat behind a slab of armor plate thick enough to stop 20mm cannon shells. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns carried 3,400 rounds, enough ammunition to strafe an entire convoy without reloading. And its dive performance, the one thing the Jug did better than anything else in the air, turned out to be the exact capability ground attack pilots needed when every mission ended with a high-speed escape through curtains of flak. But the real breakthrough came from something Republic Aviation never advertised. The P-47's wing hardpoints, originally designed for drop tanks, could carry ordnance loads that would rip the wings off a Mustang. By July, crews were hanging 500-pound bombs, 5-inch rockets, and napalm canisters under Thunderbolts in combinations the flight manual explicitly prohibited. One crew chief at A-12 jury-rigged a weapons rack from a Douglas A-20 bomber onto a P-47's wing pylon using salvaged bolts and sheet metal. The modification let pilots carry 10 rockets instead of 6. Within a week, every aircraft in the group had the same illegal setup. 8th Air Force Headquarters never officially approved it. They also never ordered anyone to take it off. The weapon that changed everything was the M8 4.5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket. It had been designed for anti-submarine patrol aircraft, slow, stable platforms attacking surfaced U-boats. Nobody thought it would work on a fighter diving at 400 miles per hour through ground fire. The rockets were unguided. The aiming system was a grease pencil mark on the canopy, and the launch rails vibrated so badly that half the shots tumbled end over end after leaving the tube. But the warhead carried 6 pounds of Composition B explosive, and when it hit a Tiger tank's top armor at a 60-degree angle, it punched straight through. The tactic developed by accident. On July 9th, Lieutenant Colonel Loren McCollum led a flight of 8 P-47s against a panzer column near St. Lo. The plan was to use the rockets like artillery, fire from level flight at 3,000 feet, and hope for proximity kills. McCollum's first salvo missed by 50 yards. The flak was too heavy to make a second pass. So he rolled inverted, pulled the nose down into a 45-degree dive, and fired his remaining rockets at 800 feet. For direct hits. 3 tanks disabled. He pulled out at treetop level doing 450 miles per hour with 88mm shells bracketing his tail. 2 days later, McCollum's entire squadron was practicing dive-bombing runs with rockets. The technique violated every safety protocol in the handbook. The minimum release altitude for rockets was 1,500 feet, and the recommended dive angle was 30 degrees. McCollum's pilots were pulling off at 500 feet after 50-degree plunges. The G-forces grayed out half the pilots on their first attempts, but the hit rate went from 8% to over 40%. And the German armor crews, who had learned to ignore high-altitude fighter bombers, suddenly had no defense against an attack profile that gave them 3 seconds of warning. By the end of July, P-47s equipped with rockets and bombs were destroying an average of 15 tanks per day across Normandy. The Luftwaffe had mostly evacuated France by then. German fighters were needed to defend the Reich from B-17s. That left the Thunderbolt units free to perfect the one mission nobody else wanted: flying into the teeth of the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses in history to hit targets the heavy bombers couldn't reach. The Germans adapted faster than Allied intelligence expected. Within 2 weeks of the first rocket attacks, Wehrmacht flak crews had redeployed every available 88mm gun to cover the primary roads out of the Normandy pocket. They didn't try to hit the aircraft on approach. That was impossible against targets moving at 400 miles per hour. Instead, they pre-sighted every likely pull-off corridor and waited for the P-47s to bottom out of their dives. The moment a Thunderbolt leveled off after a rocket run, 3 or 4 flak batteries opened fire simultaneously. The pilots called it the Gauntlet. Survival rates dropped below 50% for missions into what the 405th Fighter Group started marking on maps as Flak Alley. A 12-mile stretch of road between Mortain and Falaise where the Germans had concentrated their heaviest anti-aircraft defenses. Every pilot in the group knew the statistics. For sorties into the alley gave you a coin flip chance of making it home. 8 sorties, and the odds said you weren't coming back. The group flew 16 sorties a day. Captain John Voigt's aircraft took a 20mm shell through the right wing on August 3rd. The shell didn't explode. It punched a hole the size of a dinner plate through the wing spar and kept going. Voigt felt the impact, saw the wing flex, and made it back to A-12 flying at 180 miles per hour with the stick pulled hard left to compensate for the missing lift. The crew chief counted 47 flak holes in the airframe. They patched it with sheet metal and sent it back up the next morning. Lieutenant James Barr wasn't as lucky. On August 6th, his P-47 took a direct hit from an 88mm shell at 600 feet. Right in the engine. The radial motor absorbed most of the blast, but the fuel lines ruptured and the cockpit filled with burning vapor. Barr got the canopy open, stood up into a 300-mile-per-hour slipstream, and jumped. His parachute opened at 200 feet. He landed in a field 300 yards behind German lines, broke his ankle, and spent the next 4 days crawling toward Allied positions. A patrol from the 2nd Armored Division found him on August 10th, 5 miles inside friendly territory, still wearing his Mae West. The losses were unsustainable, but the German armored columns trapped in the Falaise Pocket had to move, and every road they tried to use was under constant attack from P-47s. By early August, Wehrmacht commanders were abandoning tanks that still had fuel and ammunition because the crews refused to drive them in daylight. August 7, 1944. The German 7th Army was collapsing into the Falaise Pocket, a 20-mile-wide corridor between Allied pincers that was rapidly closing. Intelligence estimated 100,000 Wehrmacht troops and 2 panzer divisions were trying to escape east before the Canadians and Americans linked up and sealed the trap. The only viable route out was a series of roads converging near the town of Argenton. If those roads stayed open for another 48 hours, the bulk of Germany's armored strength in France would escape to fight another day. 8th Air Force Headquarters issued a direct order to all fighter groups in Normandy: close the roads. Use everything you have. The 405th Fighter Group launched at dawn with 16 P-47s, every operational aircraft on the field. Each Thunderbolt carried 2 500-pound bombs, 10 rockets, and a full combat load of .50 caliber ammunition. The flight plan was suicide, a straight-line approach into the most heavily defended 12 square miles in France, followed by repeated attack runs until either the roads were blocked or the group ran out of aircraft. No fighter escort. No suppression runs by medium bombers. Just 16 pilots and the assumption that at least some of them would make it through. They hit the first column at 0620 hours. Major Francis Gabreski led the initial dive, releasing both bombs into a concentration of trucks at a crossroads 3 miles north of Argenton. The explosions flipped 2 trucks onto their sides and blocked the road. The next 7 aircraft followed in 30-second intervals, putting rockets and bombs into the stalled convoy. By the time the flak gunners acquired the attack pattern, 11 vehicles were burning and the road was impassable. Then the Germans opened fire. Every 88mm battery in the sector had been waiting for exactly this scenario. The sky filled with black puffs of shrapnel, not random fire, but carefully coordinated barges timed to catch the P-47s as they pulled out of their dives. Lieutenant Raymond Dyer's aircraft took a direct hit at 700 feet. The wings separated and the fuselage tumbled into a forest. Lieutenant Charles Anderson's engine seized from flak damage 30 seconds after pull-off. He nursed the dying Thunderbolt 6 miles west before belly landing in a British-held field. The remaining 14 aircraft made a second pass, then a third. By 0700 hours, for separate roads were blocked by burning vehicles, and the Wehrmacht convoys had stopped moving entirely. German troops were abandoning their trucks and retreating on foot into the forests. The P-47s went down to 200 feet and strafed the tree lines where the infantry was taking cover. Captain Robert Johnson, the pilot from the opening scene, was on his 4th pass when the flak finally caught him. The shell entered through the engine cowling, severed the oil lines, and set the entire power plant on fire. He had enough altitude to glide, but nowhere safe to land. Below him, The roads were choked with wreckage his squadron had just created. He could see German tanks burning at every intersection. The Wehrmacht's last escape route out of Normandy was closed. Johnson aimed for the longest clear stretch of road he could find, dropped his landing gear, and put the P-47 down at 140 miles per hour on a two-lane highway packed with German soldiers. The aircraft stayed intact for almost 300 feet before the landing gear collapsed and the fuselage started cartwheeling. Johnson blacked out on the third impact. When he came to, Canadian infantry was pulling him out of the cockpit. He'd landed 200 yards inside Allied lines. The wreckage of his P-47 was still blocking the road. By noon on August 7th, the 405th Fighter Group had flown 42 sorties into the Falaise Pocket. They'd lost 5 aircraft and 2 pilots. Reconnaissance photos taken that evening showed 32 destroyed tanks, over 200 vehicles burning or abandoned, and 8 miles of roads rendered impassable. The Wehrmacht never reopened those routes. The Falaise Pocket closed 2 days later. 50,000 German soldiers surrendered. The armored divisions that had held Normandy for 2 months ceased to exist as fighting formations. The official 8th Air Force after-action report for the Falaise Pocket credited strategic bombing with destroying German supply lines and heavy bombers with neutralizing enemy armor. Fighter bombers were mentioned in a single paragraph on page 14. The P-47's contribution. Over 3,000 sorties in 30 days, 489 confirmed tank kills, and the destruction of the road network that trapped the German 7th Army, was summarized in 2 sentences. The report concluded that the Normandy campaign demonstrated the decisive importance of high-altitude precision bombing and recommended expanding B-17 production for the final push into Germany. The pilots who had actually flown the missions knew better. But by September 1944, the strategic bombing narrative had already solidified in Washington and London. The press wanted stories about Mustang aces dogfighting over Berlin, not mud-covered P-47 pilots sleeping in tents and flying 4 ground attack sorties a day. The Pentagon wanted to justify the billions spent on heavy bombers, not highlight the fact that a cheaper, simpler aircraft designed in 1940 had proven more effective at actually destroying German armor. When the Air Force published its official history of the European Air War in 1948, the P-47 was relegated to a supporting role. The aircrews knew the truth. Between June and September 1944, P-47 units in France flew 423,435 combat sorties, more than all other Allied fighter types combined. They destroyed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. Their loss rate was 0.7% per sortie, the lowest of any fighter type operating in the theater. The Thunderbolt's kill-to-loss ratio in air combat was 11-1. Its survivability rate after battle damage was 3 times higher than the P-51. None of that made it into the popular histories. When Americans think about World War II fighter aircraft, they picture Mustangs. The Thunderbolt became a footnote, the ugly, heavy, forgettable workhorse that happened to be in the background while the glamorous fighters won the war. Every pilot who flew the Jug knew that narrative was backwards. But by the time anyone thought to ask them, the jet age had arrived, and nobody cared about piston engine fighters anymore. The numbers told a different story. Of the 15,636 P-47s built during the war, 11,874 survived to V-Day. Of the 15,586 P-51s built, 7,956 were lost. The Thunderbolt brought its pilots home. And in a war where most fighter pilots didn't survive their first 10 missions, that was the only statistic that actually mattered. Lieutenant Raymond Dyer from Wisconsin was 23 years old when his P-47 broke apart over Argentine on August 7th. He'd flown 17 combat missions. His crew chief found his flight gloves in the cockpit wreckage 3 days later, the only thing that survived the impact intact. Dyer had written his mother's address inside the left glove in pencil. The Air Force sent her a telegram on August 12th and a Purple Heart in October. His name appears on a memorial wall in Normandy. The road he died trying to close remained blocked for the rest of the war. Captain Robert Johnson survived the war with 27 confirmed kills and a chest full of medals he never wore. He went back to flying after recovering from the injuries he sustained in the crash landing. He flew 38 more combat missions before the Army grounded him in October and sent him home. After the war, he refused to talk about Normandy. When reporters asked him about being a fighter ace, he'd tell them to ask about the pilots who didn't come back. He died in 1998 at the age of 78. His obituary mentioned his aerial victories, but not the day he landed a burning P-47 on a German-held road and lived. Major Francis Gabreski became the top-scoring American ace in Europe with 34 confirmed kills. He flew P-47s for his entire combat tour and credited the aircraft's durability with saving his life on at least 6 occasions. In a 1989 interview, he said the Thunderbolt was the reason he survived the war. He also said it was the reason thousands of soldiers on the ground survived, because the P-47 could carry bombs and rockets to targets no other fighter could reach, and it could take the punishment required to get there and back. The 405th Fighter Group lost 42 pilots between June and September 1944. Most of them died in the Falaise Pocket. Their names are carved into stone at the Normandy American Cemetery. Tourists walk past those markers every day on their way to see the beaches. Very few of them know what those pilots were flying, or what they were doing when they died, or why the roads through Argentine stayed closed long enough to trap an entire German army. The pilots knew. The ground troops who watched P-47 strafe the roads ahead of their advance knew. The Wehrmacht soldiers who spent August 1944 hiding in ditches every time they heard a radial engine knew. Everyone who was actually there knew what the Thunderbolt did. But history is written by people who weren't there. And the story they chose to tell didn't have room for the ugly, heavy, forgettable fighter that won the most important air campaign of the war. The P-47 Thunderbolt destroyed more enemy equipment, flew more combat sorties, and brought home more pilots than any other American fighter in World War II. It was never the fastest aircraft in the sky, or the most maneuverable, or the one that captured the public imagination. But when the missions required flying into the worst flak in Europe to destroy targets that actually mattered, the tanks, the trucks, the roads, the infrastructure that kept armies moving, there was only one fighter that could do it and survive. The official histories got it wrong, not because they lied, but because they measured the wrong things. They counted air-to-air victories and bomber escort missions and forgot that wars are won on the ground. The Thunderbolt didn't win by looking good or flying high or chasing headlines. It won by being exactly what the pilots needed when the killing was happening at 500 feet and there was no second chance.